They said I'd break my back on the first day, that I'd be a burden, a shadow, a joke among men half my age. The words weren't whispered in secret. They carried through the morning air on the construction site, wrapped in laughter sharp enough to cut. He had barely stepped onto the gravel when he heard it. 72? He'll slow us down. He should be home feeding pigeons, not here swinging hammers. Every chuckle, every smirk landed on him heavier than the steel beams stacked in the corner. He kept walking. His boots sank into the dirt with the same steady rhythm that had carried him through 5 decades of labor. They looked at him like an antique misplaced among machines, something too fragile to be useful, too outdated to matter. But inside he burned. The ache of those whispers pressed on him harder than age ever had. He did not show it. He kept his face still, his gaze forward. To them, his silence looked like weakness. To him, it was armor. One of the younger men nudged his friend and said louder than he should have, "He won't last till noon. He'll sit down, beg for water, and we'll be left picking up after him." The others laughed again, not cruelly enough to be called hatred, but sharp enough to humiliate. That was worse. He wasn't even their enemy, just their punchline. He gripped the handle of his old lunchbox, the same one he'd carried since his 30s, paint chipped, corners dented. It wasn't just metal, it was memory, proof that he had survived storms these boys had never even imagined. In that moment he wanted to turn, to say, "I was pouring foundations before your fathers learned to tie their boots. I was raising beams while you were learning to walk." But he said nothing. Words would have been too small. Instead, he climbed onto the platform and waited for orders, his heart beating steady, his mind repeating a single vow. I will not slow them down. I will not be their weakness. I will outlast their arrogance. And somewhere, beneath the laughter, there was already silence forming. The kind that comes when men are about to learn a lesson they'll never forget. Friends, let's pause for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this every day. Now, let's continue. When he stepped fully onto the site that first morning, it felt less like entering a workplace and more like crossing into enemy ground. Conversations dulled when he passed, but not out of respect, out of judgment. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and though no words were spoken, the message rang loud. You do not belong here. Not a single man extended a hand in greeting, not even the courtesy of a nod. They stood with arms crossed, leaning on shovels and machines, watching him as though he were a problem that had just arrived in boots and a weathered jacket. Their stares carried no welcome, only calculation, measuring how long he would last before breaking, predicting the exact hour his body would betray him. There was no patience in their eyes, no willingness to wait and see what he could still give. To them, he was a relic, taking up space that should belong to younger, stronger men. The air itself felt heavy with doubt. He could feel it pressing on him like the weight of the unfinished steel beams towering above, as if their very shadows cast judgment on his presence. He remembered walking onto sites decades earlier, when men greeted each other with handshakes that crushed fingers, when respect was earned in sweat and silence. But here, in this moment, there was none of that. He was an outsider among his own kind. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of labor, hung at his sides, eager for work, but no one offered him tools. No one gave him a task. They let him stand there, as though waiting for him to confess his own weakness and walk away on his own. The humiliation cut deep, but deeper still was the loneliness. He was surrounded by men, yet isolated as if behind glass. And yet he did not shrink. He straightened his back, worn though it was, and let their cold stares wash over him like rain. He had faced storms before, storms that toppled scaffolding and split roofs apart. Compared to that, these glares were nothing. He told himself, they may not see it now, but the ground beneath their boots remembers me. Every foundation I've laid, every wall I've raised, this earth knows my hands. He adjusted his gloves slowly, deliberately, refusing to let them see even the smallest tremor of age. He would not falter. If they denied him respect with their eyes, then he would carve it out with his endurance. For respect built on sweat never fades, and before the day was over, their stares would change. They did not hand him the good tools. The polished hammers, the sturdy gloves, the new levels and drills, those were reserved for younger hands, hands they trusted. For him, they laid aside what no one else wanted, a hammer with a loose head that rattled with every shake, gloves too stiff and too large, worn through at the seams. The handles of the tools were splintered, the edges dulled, the kind of equipment meant not for work but for mockery. They were testing him. No, worse, they were dismissing him before he had even begun. When he picked up the hammer, the wood felt unbalanced, sliding against his grip as if it longed to betray him. The men watched, waiting for him to fumble, waiting for the tremor of age to show itself. It wasn't just an assignment, it was an insult, a quiet declaration that he was unworthy of the craft, that even the tools rebelled against his presence. His gloves hung loose around his fingers, useless against the steel and wood he would need to carry. He could have complained, could have demanded proper gear, but he said nothing. He had been handed worse in life, and still built greatness from it. The insult burned, but it also fueled him. He thought of the hundreds of times he had worked without gloves at all, his bare hands torn and bloodied yet stronger for it. He thought of the beams he had raised with nothing but rope and sweat, years before cranes came to make it easy. If they wanted to see him stumble under weakness, they had chosen the wrong man. Age had stripped him of speed, but it had given him something they did not yet understand: endurance, the kind that no broken hammer could defeat. He wrapped his fingers tighter around the loose handle and lifted it, as if it were the finest tool forged. Every swing would hurt more. Every grip would rub his palms raw, but pain was a language his body had long spoken fluently. Let them laugh, let them test him. He would turn their scraps into proof, their cast-offs into testament. He would make every blow ring louder than their scorn. And as he squared his shoulders and set his eyes on the first task, he whispered inside himself, "You think you've weakened me, but you've only reminded me who I am. I was not made by perfect tools. I was made by struggle." By the end of that day, they would understand. It was never the tool that defined the builder. It was the hands that held it. Every wrinkle on his face carried the weight of a story. Each scar across his hands was a record of battles fought not with weapons, but with beams, bricks, storms, and time itself. He could feel the years pressing on him like an invisible load, the stiffness in his knees, the heaviness in his back, the slow burn in his lungs after every lift. Time had left its mark, and he was painfully aware of it. But what the young men around him did not see was that within those same lines of age lived decades of strength, muscle forged through repetition, endurance carved into bone. He remembered mornings when he was barely 20, running to the site before dawn, his body so full of fire he thought it would never fade. He remembered carrying weights twice his size, climbing frames without harness, moving through danger as if it could never touch him. And now, more than 50 years later, the fire had dimmed, but it had not gone out. It had simply changed. It was not the reckless flame of youth anymore. It was the steady burn of a furnace that never stopped working, no matter how the years tried to cool it. As he lifted a bag of cement onto his shoulder, he felt the sharp protest of his joints, the creak of age running through him. He staggered for a moment, and he saw from the corner of his eye the younger workers smirking, ready to witness his collapse. But he adjusted his stance, found his balance, and carried the load across the gravel without a word. Every step was defiance, every breath proof that the years had not broken him, only tempered him. The truth was simple. Yes, age slowed him, but it had also taught him how to last. He could no longer sprint, but he could endure. He could no longer outpace the young in bursts, but he could outwork them through hours, through days, through the long grind that demanded more than muscle. It demanded will. His body bore the reminders of time, but his spirit carried something far heavier: responsibility, pride, and the knowledge that every wall, every beam, every road he had built still stood because he had never given in to weakness. The wrinkles on his face were not signs of failure. They were medals. The aches in his bones were not burdens. They were proof of service. The weight of the years was real, crushing at times, but he wore it like armor. For he knew that strength was not measured in how much you could lift at once, but in how long you could carry it, and he had carried a lifetime. And as the sun beat down on the site, his sweat mixed with dust, he thought, "Let them see my age. Let them see my struggle. What they do not know yet is that the weight of 72 years has built a man they cannot break." The laughter came sharp and sudden, cutting through the rhythm of the workday like a hammer striking steel. He had just placed his foot on the ladder when one of the younger men, unable to resist the urge to perform for his peers, shouted, "Hey, old man, don't fall off the steps!" For a moment the entire site erupted. The sound wasn't just laughter, it was the echo of contempt, a chorus of dismissal that rang louder than the machines around them. They weren't laughing at a mistake, they were laughing at the idea of him, at the image of a body too aged to belong, too fragile to endure. The humiliation was heavier than any beam he had lifted that morning. He felt it press into his chest, sinking into the deepest part of him. These were men who had never seen the storms he had weathered, who had never tasted the grit of survival when the work was brutal and unforgiving. Yet here they were, mocking the very hands that had built the kind of foundations they now worked upon. His instinct was to respond, to remind them of what those hands had done, of the years when no man dared laugh in his direction. But his lips did not part. Silence became his weapon. He continued climbing, one step after another, with the steadiness of a man who refused to give them the spectacle they craved. Each rung under his boot felt like defiance, each pull upward a declaration. "You will not break me." The laughter behind him began to fade, not because they regretted it, but because it lost its power when he gave it no reaction. Their mockery clattered to the ground, while he rose above it, literally and figuratively, until he stood at the top of the frame, the sun on his back, his figure outlined against the sky. From up there he looked down and saw them still watching, smirks lingering on their faces, but weaker now, less certain. They had wanted him to stumble, to prove their judgment right. Instead, he had carried himself with the calm steadiness of someone who had nothing left to prove, and yet everything to remind them of. The wind brushed against his face, carrying with it not their laughter, but the memory of men he once worked beside, men who respected silence, who measured worth in labor, not in words. He clenched the faulty hammer in his hand and drove a nail into the beam. The strike echoed across the site, louder, truer than their laughter had been. That sound was his answer, a rhythm of defiance that no jeer could drown out. He did not need to shout back. His work was his voice, and every swing declared what his silence had already promised, that dignity could not be mocked, that strength could not be erased by cruelty. And though their chuckles carried on for a while longer, the seed of unease had already been planted, because deep inside they all knew, when laughter fades, only truth remains. And the truth was this: he was still standing, still working, still unbroken. As the sun bore down and sweat stung his eyes, his mind drifted far from the noise of the sight. The laughter still lingered in the air, but he let it fade, carried away by memory. He remembered the first beam he ever lifted, back when his hands were still new to the weight of steel and timber. He had been 20, lean and untested, standing before a skeleton of wood that would soon become his family's first home. There were no safety lines then, no harnesses or polished helmets, only raw strength, youthful fire, and the unshakable belief that he could build something from nothing. He could still feel the ache in his shoulders from that day, the burn in his lungs as he carried the beam alone, because no one else was there to help. He remembered the sound of it thudding into place, the vibration that ran through his bones when it settled against the frame. That sound had been more than construction. It had been a promise, a vow that he would never allow his family to live without shelter, that his sweat would become their walls, his labor their roof. He remembered looking at that unfinished structure and seeing not just wood and nails, but the shape of safety, of future, of love carved into every line. The faces of his younger self and his wife flashed before him. Her smile when she saw the house rise from the dirt, her hands brushing against the fresh wood as if it were a miracle. He thought of his children running barefoot across the dusty floor before it was finished, laughing as though the half-built house was already a palace. That beam, heavy as it was, had carried more than weight. It had carried hope, and it had carried him into the man he became. Those memories did not weaken him now. They fueled him. Every sneer from the young workers, every glance of doubt, only reminded him of what they did not know. They did not know what it was to work through hunger, to build by candlelight when electricity was a luxury. They did not know what it meant to hammer nails with hands split open from frost, to raise walls while storms tried to tear them back down. They thought strength was in youth, but he knew the truth. Strength lived in persistence, in the refusal to stop, in the memory of why you began. Standing on that site, mocked and underestimated, he carried not just the weight of 72 years, but the echo of every beam, every wall, every roof he had ever built. The past was alive in him, and it gave him more power than any taunt could take away. He whispered silently to himself, though his lips did not move, "I have built before. I will build again. My body remembers, my spirit remembers, and no laughter can strip that away." He raised his hammer again, and with every strike he felt the echo of his youth, not gone, not lost, but woven into him, carrying him forward. The first beam had made him. Now, decades later, the memory of it would carry him higher than their scorn ever could. The day had grown long, and the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the steel skeleton of the site. Work had been steady until the moment everything stopped. The crane, the machine they all depended on, groaned and then fell silent, a mechanical failure freezing the work mid-progress. The beam dangled in place, suspended, unsteady, threatening to undo hours of labor if it wasn't secured quickly. The foreman barked orders, but no one moved. The task was clear. Someone had to climb up, steady it by hand, and fix it into place. The younger men looked at each other, their bravado suddenly quiet. No one wanted the risk. The beam swayed with the breeze, heavy and unforgiving, and the thought of losing footing up there turned their confidence into hesitation. Feet shuffled in the gravel, eyes looked away, excuses lingered unspoken on their lips. They were strong, yes, but strength means little when fear takes hold. And then, before hesitation could spread any further, he stepped forward. His knees ached, his hands trembled, but his resolve was unshakable. He had spent his youth walking beams with no harness, balancing his life on wood and steel when construction meant danger every single day. This was not new to him. The years had taken much, but not his courage. He grabbed the rope, adjusted his loose gloves, and began to climb. The murmurs started behind him, some mocking, some doubtful, some tinged with disbelief, but none of them stopped him. The height pressed against him as he ascended, each step pulling at his lungs, each grip testing his muscles. He could feel the tremor in his arms, the rebellion of a body not as young as it once was. And yet, with every movement, he forced his body to remember the beams of his 20s, the storms of his 40s, the endless labor of his 50s. His body had been through worse, and his spirit had never let him fall. At the top, the wind cut against his face, and the beam swung just enough to test his balance. Below, the workers stared in silence, waiting for him to falter, waiting for the confirmation of their doubts. But instead, they watched as he reached out, steadied the beam with trembling arms, and with precise, deliberate force, drove it into its place. The strike of his hammer echoed across the site like thunder, a sound not of weakness but of defiance, of endurance refusing to bow. When it was done, the beam held firm, no longer swaying, locked into the frame of the structure. He exhaled slowly, his chest heaving, his body heavy with effort, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He stood tall against the skyline, not as a relic, not as a burden, but as proof. Proof that courage does not retire, that strength is not measured by age, and that dignity is earned not by words but by deeds. The silence below was thick. Where once there had been laughter, there was only awe, though no one dared admit it yet. He climbed down slowly, each step steady, his head held high. He had passed the first test. Not for them, not even for the foreman who watched in quiet astonishment, but for himself. And in that moment he knew. The fight was not about proving he could still work. It was about showing that years do not erase worth. They write it deeper. When his boots finally touched the ground again, there was no applause, no cheer, no slap on the back to say, "Well done." Instead, there was silence, thick, raw, undeniable silence. The same men who had laughed the loudest now kept their mouths shut. The smirks that had curled on their lips only hours before had been erased, replaced by something far heavier, the weight of witnessing what they could not deny. His chest heaved, his lungs burned, and sweat soaked through his shirt, but his gaze did not falter. He stood tall, shoulders squared, looking at the unfinished structure as though it were nothing more than another day's work. Inside, every muscle screamed, every joint ached, but not once did he let his body betray him before their eyes. He would never allow them to see weakness, not now, not after this. The silence grew louder than their laughter had ever been. It spread across the site, slipping into every corner, settling on every man, like dust on steel. They had waited for him to stumble, for his legs to buckle, for age to win its inevitable war, but he had done what none of them dared. He had steadied the beam, with hands they called frail, with arms they said would collapse under the weight, and now, those same hands had given the building its backbone. He looked at them, not in triumph, not in anger, but in a way that cut deeper than any insult could. His eyes, tired yet unwavering, spoke without words. This is what strength looks like. Not youth, not speed, not arrogance, but endurance, resilience, and the refusal to bend. And in that moment, some of them could not meet his stare. They turned away, fiddled with tools, adjusted their gloves, trying to escape the truth now staring back at them. The foreman shifted his weight, clearing his throat. But even he found no words. Authority could not explain away what they had all just witnessed. The man they had branded, too old, too fragile, had carried the site on his shoulders when their courage had faltered. Respect had not yet been spoken aloud, but it hung there in the air, undeniable. And though no one dared to say it, he knew. He felt it in their eyes, in the stillness of their bodies, in the way laughter no longer came so easily. For the first time since he had set foot on the site, he was not invisible, not mocked, not dismissed. He was seen, truly seen. He drew in one long breath, steadying himself, and exhaled slowly, a release of years of silence and scorn. He had endured their doubt, their ridicule, their laughter. Now he had given them something they could never laugh at again. And as he turned back to his work, the silence followed him, heavier than words, more powerful than applause. It was the silence of men learning, perhaps for the first time, what respect actually looked like. The sun climbed high, unrelenting, pouring its heat over the site until the steel burned to the touch, and the air shimmered with exhaustion. It was the kind of day that drained men quickly, the kind that bent even the strongest backs and pulled groans from lips that swore they would never complain. By noon, sweat poured from every worker, their shirts clinging to their skin, their movements slower, less precise. One by one they began to pause, leaning against walls, sitting in the shade of machines, wiping their foreheads and muttering about the weight of the work. But he did not stop. His rhythm never faltered. Bag after bag of cement found its way onto his shoulders, his step steady even as his knees screamed in protest. He measured beams with a careful eye, adjusted levels with the patience of a craftsman who had lived his whole life by the line of truth. His hammer rose and fell in unbroken tempo, each strike ringing like a heartbeat, steady and certain. His body trembled at times, but he never let the tremor define him. The years pressed on him, yes, but so did his will, stronger than any ache, fiercer than any fatigue. The younger men whispered now, not with laughter but with disbelief. They had mocked him in the morning, but by afternoon they were watching him with uneasy eyes. Some of them sat with water bottles in their hands, chests heaving, while he pushed forward, carrying loads that should have belonged to 2 men, not 1. They shook their heads, confused, even ashamed, as they realized he was outlasting them. Every task became a kind of defiance. Every nail driven, every beam checked, every stone moved was his answer to their doubt. He did not speak, did not boast, did not need to. The sound of his labor was enough, echoing louder than words ever could. His silence cut deeper than their morning jokes, for in that silence lived endurance they could not match. The hours stretched long, and the sight grew heavy with fatigue. The sun slipped lower, and still he worked. His breath grew ragged, his muscles quivered with strain, but he pressed forward, unyielding. The memory of his youth carried him, the fire of his pride drove him, but most of all, it was something deeper, something they could not see, that kept him moving. The knowledge that dignity is not given, it is earned, day after day, blow after blow, step after step. By the time evening came, the younger men were shadows of themselves, backs bent, hands raw, eyes dulled with exhaustion. But he stood, sweat-soaked and weary, yet upright, still working, still pushing. He had carried the longest day on his shoulders, and when the last light faded, he was still there, unbroken. And though no words were spoken, every man on that site knew what had happened. They had waited for him to fall. Instead, they were the ones who had fallen short. The breaking point came quietly, almost without warning. One of the youngest, the loudest voice from that morning, staggered under the weight of a cement bag. His steps faltered, his legs gave way, and with a heavy thud he dropped to the ground. Dust rose around him, his breath shallow, his pride shattered. He sat there in silence, clutching his knees, no laughter left in him. Another leaned against a beam, his hand pressed to his back, groaning softly about the ache that would not let him straighten. Their faces, once proud and mocking, were pale now, worn not by years, but by the unrelenting hours of labor they could not withstand. And through it all, the old man moved forward. His shirt was drenched, clinging to his body, every fiber of him soaked with sweat. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his breath heavy and uneven, yet his steps did not falter. He bent, he lifted, he hammered, he measured, as though the years on his shoulders were not chains but wings. Each wrinkle on his skin seemed to fuel him rather than weaken him. The sight was almost unnatural, this figure, carved by time, refusing to yield when those half his age had already collapsed. Their pride crumbled faster than their strength. They had built their confidence on youth, on muscles untested by hardship, on the arrogance of thinking time was on their side. But time itself had betrayed them, for beside them stood a man who had spent decades in its company, who had turned struggle into endurance and pain into discipline. He did not need to outpace them. He outlasted them. His body bore scars they would never know, and it was those scars that carried him now. The sight grew quieter as more of them slowed, resting on steel bars, bending over their tools, stealing glances at him with disbelief. No one dared to laugh anymore. The jokes had turned to silence, the silence to unease, and the unease to a dawning respect they were too ashamed to voice. Their youth had promised them strength, but it was his years that delivered it. He felt the pain, every joint screaming, every muscle burning, but he welcomed it. Pain was an old companion, one he had walked beside his whole life. It did not frighten him. It reminded him that he was alive, that he was still fighting. And in those long hours, it became his ally. Where others saw defeat, he saw proof. Proof that the years had not stolen his worth. They had sharpened it. As the sun bled into the horizon, he carried another load across the gravel, his shadow stretching long and unbroken. Behind him, the younger men sat in silence, their bodies spent, their pride fractured, their eyes lowered. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not even glance their way. He did not need to. His endurance had already spoken for him, louder than any words could. And in that moment, they all understood. Youth is a fire that burns fast and bright, but his strength was something greater. It was a flame that time itself could not extinguish. The supervisor had been watching from the edges all day, clipboard in hand, cigarettes smoldering between his fingers, eyes sharp with judgment. In the morning, when the old man first stepped onto the site, his gaze had been filled with quiet mockery, the same disbelief that lived in the younger workers. He had seen too many men past their prime try to hold on to labor that no longer belonged to them, men whose bodies betrayed them after the first hour, men who thought pride alone could carry weight heavier than their bones allowed. He had expected the same here, an old man clutching his back, slowing the line of work, becoming nothing more than an inconvenience. But as the hours stretched, his smirk began to fade. He saw the way the younger men leaned against the beams, their eyes dulled, their hands trembling from exhaustion. He saw one collapse into the dirt, another hide his pain behind gritted teeth, and yet the old man did not stop. Bag after bag of cement, beam after beam, measurement after measurement, he kept moving. The sweat dripping from his brow was not defeat. It was proof of endurance, carved into every deliberate motion. The supervisor found himself lowering the cigarette, his eyes narrowing not in ridicule but in something closer to awe. The old man did not rush, did not boast, did not even look to see if anyone was watching. He worked as though the world around him did not exist, as though the only thing that mattered was the task in front of him. His hands, scarred and trembling, held the hammer like a weapon, driving each nail with a precision that no shaky grip could disguise. It wasn't just labor, it was craft. And the supervisor, hardened by years of overseeing men, recognized it. What he saw now was not a relic, not a burden, but a builder, a master of the trade whose worth could not be measured in years of age, but in decades of skill. Respect began to settle where doubt had lived. The old man had carried the site on his shoulders that day, not with youthful energy, but with the discipline of a lifetime. The foreman realized that while the others looked to him for instructions, he himself could learn something from the figure who had been underestimated from the very beginning. The clipboard hung loosely in his hand now. The cigarette burned to ash between his fingers, forgotten. His lips pressed together not in disapproval, but in the unspoken recognition of truth. The man before him was not here to prove anything to anyone. He was here because building was in his blood, because labor was the language he had spoken his entire life. He was not just another worker on the site. He was the embodiment of what work meant. For the first time that day, The supervisor's eyes softened. The old man was no longer a nuisance to be tolerated, but a force to be respected. And though he said nothing, though the silence between them stretched, the old man felt the weight of that gaze shift. It was not pity, not ridicule. It was acknowledgment. And acknowledgment, after all the laughter, was the first step toward respect. By the time the shadows began to stretch across the site and the day's labor neared its end, the air had changed. The mocking whispers that once filled every corner of the yard had gone silent, replaced by something new, something quieter, heavier. The same mouths that had laughed at him now spoke in hushed tones, not to ridicule, but to marvel. It began almost reluctantly, a single voice carried just enough for others to hear. "Did you see the way he steadied that section?" Another followed, uncertain, almost embarrassed by the truth it revealed. "He's faster than us, stronger even." The words were not shouted. They were not offered openly, but they moved through the crew like wind through scaffolding, subtle, undeniable, changing the air itself. He could feel it, though he pretended not to notice. He kept his focus on the work, the weight in his hands, the rhythm of his hammer. But inside he heard every word, not because he needed their validation, but because the sound of respect, however quiet, cut deeper than any insult they had thrown that morning. The young men who once smirked now lowered their voices, glancing at him with something they had not shown before, caution, even admiration. They watched the steadiness of his movements, the unbroken line of his endurance, and it unsettled them. For the first time, they began to understand that strength was not measured in muscle alone. Strength was the will to rise when others fell, to carry on when others gave in. And he embodied that truth in every step, every swing, every bead of sweat. Even those who still clung to their pride could not deny it. They had seen him climb where they hesitated, lift what they struggled with, endure what they could not. He had stood taller with every task, until the memory of their laughter felt like something childish, something shameful. Now, when they spoke of him, their tones carried not cruelty, but a reluctant respect, as though admitting it too loudly might break the fragile pride they still held. The foreman caught the whispers too, his jaw tightening, not in disapproval but in acknowledgement. What had begun as doubt, what had been mocked as weakness, had turned into something undeniable. The man they had expected to fail had instead redefined the day, and no one could take that truth back. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not even lift his head to show he had heard. He simply worked. Because for him, respect was not won by whispers. It was carved in wood, in steel, in sweat. He had not come to change their minds. He had come to do what he had always done, to build. Yet in doing so, he had begun to build something else, something far less tangible than beams and walls. He had built the beginnings of reverence, the first cracks in the wall of their arrogance. And though the murmurs were faint, almost secret, they were there. And once respect begins to grow, even as a whisper, it cannot be silenced. It only spreads until it becomes impossible to ignore. The project had reached a breaking point. The crane had been repaired, but the delay had thrown the schedule into chaos. Materials piled in the wrong place, deadlines loomed like storm clouds, and the crew stood restless, arguing among themselves about what to do. Voices rose in frustration, each man trying to shout louder than the next, but no solution came. The structure towered half-finished, a skeleton of steel and sweat, and the foreman's face was tight with worry. Every wasted minute bled money, every wrong move risked collapse. In the middle of the storm, he stood silent, watching. He saw what they could not see. Angles, balance, the hidden rhythm of the site that only decades of building had trained his eyes to catch. He noticed the placement of the beams, the way the loads had been stacked, the weak points forming not from bad design, but from impatience and oversight. He listened to their arguments and realized they were chasing noise instead of answers. And then, without raising his voice, he spoke. His words were slow, steady, unhurried, but they cut through the noise like a blade. He explained where the error lay, how shifting one section, bracing another, and moving the cement line would not only fix the delay, but save hours of wasted work. At first, they almost dismissed him. The old man with sweat-soaked clothes and trembling hands. But the foreman, desperate and sharp enough to recognize truth when he heard it, silenced the crew and said, "Go on." For the first time, they listened, truly listened. His voice carried no arrogance, no need to prove himself. It carried only the calm authority of a man who had solved problems like this 1,000 times before. As he laid out the steps, even the loudest doubters grew quiet, their pride bowing under the weight of his clarity. The plan was simple but elegant, the kind of solution born not of guesswork but of lived experience, of failures endured and lessons carved into memory. When they set his idea into motion, the chaos unraveled. The blocked path opened, the workflow smoothed, and in less than an hour the site began to move again, faster, cleaner, more efficient than it had all day. The foreman gave a short nod in his direction. Not a smile, not praise, but something heavier, acknowledgement, respect, and the younger men, though they said nothing, exchanged glances that betrayed what they felt. The man they had mocked, doubted, laughed at, had just saved them from ruin. He did not bask in their silence, nor in their newfound respect. He simply picked up his hammer and returned to work, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But in that moment, everything had changed. He was no longer invisible, no longer the subject of derision. He had become the man whose voice carried weight, whose presence steadied the ground beneath their feet. The day of reckoning had come, not in anger, not in triumph, but in truth revealed. And in the quiet that followed, every man on that site knew. He was not just surviving the work. He was leading it. He could have spoken. He could have turned to the young men, pointed at the finished section, and demanded they remember their laughter from that morning. He could have thrown their words back at them, every "too old," every "too slow," every smirk that had cut like a blade. He could have reminded them that when they faltered, when they hesitated, it was his hands, his eyes, his voice that saved the day. But he did not. He let the silence stand, let it fill the air thicker than dust, heavier than steel. His dignity needed no audience, no gloating, no petty victory. Instead, he bent once more to his work. The rhythm of his labor was steady, deliberate, unbroken, each motion more eloquent than speeches, each strike of the hammer louder than scolding. There was no need for "I told you so." The building itself spoke for him. The beams aligned, the foundation steadied, the progress restored because of him. That was his answer, not in words, but in deeds carved into steel and cement. The young men watched him now, not with mockery, but with something more complicated, shame braided with awe. They had seen him outlast their strength, seen him silence their arrogance, seen him stand taller than any insult thrown his way. And yet he did not demand an apology, did not bask in their defeat. His silence was his triumph, his stillness his crown. That choice, restraint over revenge, cut them deeper than anger ever could. The foreman, too, said nothing, though his gaze lingered longer than before. In that gaze was recognition, but also humility. For dignity like this could not be ordered or taught. It could only be lived, proven by years of carrying burdens without complaint, of doing what needed to be done, even when no one believed you could. The old man's body trembled under the weight of a long day, but his spirit stood unshaken. The others searched for words but found none. He had taken every insult, every doubt, and transformed them into proof, quiet, unyielding proof, and in that quiet there was more power than any roar of pride could have carried. The sun dipped low, bathing the site in gold, and still he worked. No fury, No bitterness, no need to scold, just the quiet dignity of a man who had shown, once and for all, that worth is not measured by youth, but by perseverance, not in noise, but in silence that leaves no room for denial. And though he never looked their way, the men around him knew the truth. His silence had said everything. When the last beam was secured, and the dust of the site finally settled, the building stood not only as a structure of steel and stone, but as a monument to endurance. It was more than walls, more than concrete poured and cured. It was proof that labor is not bound by years, but by spirit. The day came when the project was handed over, the paperwork signed, the keys delivered, and in the office, a small plaque appeared on the wall. It was not large, not polished in gold, but it bore words heavier than any metal. Begin with conscience. The crew read it, some with bowed heads, some with quiet understanding. They all knew why it was there. It was not for the machines that had failed, not for the schedules they had broken, not for the chaos that had nearly ruined them. It was for him, the man they had laughed at, doubted, dismissed, the man whose silence steadied them, whose endurance saved them, whose very presence forced them to see themselves clearly. That phrase, carved into wood, was not about rules. It was about example, his example. From that day forward, they no longer saw him as an old man. Age fell away, wrinkles faded in their eyes, and what remained was something larger, something unshakable. He was not a relic of the past. He was a living reminder of what it meant to build, to carry, to endure without surrender. His hands had done more than hold tools. They had carved lessons into their memory, lessons that could not be erased by time. Every callus, every scar was a story, and those stories had been written into the very bones of the structure around them. The younger men, once quick to mock, found themselves mimicking his steadiness, his patience, his refusal to waste words. They began to measure their worth, not in how fast they could finish, but in how well they could endure. His strength lingered in the way they carried themselves, in the way they treated the work, even in the way they treated each other. He had changed the site without ever raising his voice. His silence had become their guide. For him, it was never about proving anything. It was never about defeating their laughter or demanding respect. It was about the work itself, the dignity of labor, the pride of leaving behind something that would stand long after his bones had grown too tired to lift. That was his legacy. Not in the wages earned, not in the fleeting opinions of others, but in the permanence of what his hands had created. And so his name became part of the building itself. It was not written on blueprints or etched into stone, but it lived in the memory of every man who had stood beside him. It lived in the walls that rose against the sky, in the beams that would not fall, in the quiet shift of pride that had broken inside them. His legacy was undeniable, unerasable, not because he demanded it, but because he built it, nail by nail, breath by breath, year after year. The building stood tall, but taller still was the lesson he left behind, that dignity does not age, that strength does not retire, and that hands shaped by decades of labor can leave a mark deeper than steel, deeper than stone, deeper than time itself. And when they spoke of him after, they did not say he was old. They said he was the master. He was the conscience. He was the builder.